This is the security session, and we're going to talk about security from a standards-based perspective. I'm not going to take too much time. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. His name is Jasper Peters with Riedel Communications, and he's going to be talking about one of the standards and how the security relates to it. So please welcome Jasper Peters.
Thank you, Mark. So my name is Jasper Peters. I'm a software developer at the IP Research Department from Riedel Communications, and today I'm going to talk about security for discovery and connection management of SMPTE 2110 media devices. If you attended the great speech of Willem van Most yesterday, you already know this picture. This is the technology pyramid for media nodes. It describes the minimum user requirements to build and manage an IP-based media facility. And you got different layers, and you see at the bottom layer there is the security layer, which is colored in red, which means that it's rarely available, because nearly no one has implemented proper security in their IP-based media facility. So today I'm going to talk about the secure HTTPS API calls specifically. Why do we need security? So if you got a media network where you have full control of by yourself, things look very good because you can control who can enter your network and who doesn't have to. And the problem occurs if you have some devices which are accessible via outside. So for example, via TeamViewer access, or if you want to access maybe some archiving system of the building and you want to access from out your local media network, you create small holes in your walled garden. As well as if you use wide area transport using public lines, you are exposed to the public internet. You don't know who's listening to your traffic, and therefore you have to secure this. What are the common threats? So the most known is the man-in-the-middle attack. So the simplest way to describe it is that you have the attacker entering your network, just plugging in his laptop and sniffing the communication which is going on the network. He could then read the messages which are transmitted via the network, and even worse, he could modify them. Another thing is the replay attack, where he can intercept messages and always repeat them and send it to the server in order to bring it down. So that's a vulnerability to bring servers just down in your network and cause damage that way. Then we got downgrade attacks. That's basically some configuration issue. If you have a client talking to a server, they negotiate a Cipher suit and some encryption method. Optimally a very good one, but because of interoperability, most support different sets. And a downgrade attack is that the attacker now forces the server to use a worse Cipher suit in order to use that known issues, for example. And that's just a configuration issue. You got also plain text attacks and brute force attacks, where just by using pure CPU power is used to crack your encryption. So what type of traffic I'm talking about? We can here see a very simplified setup where we got a registry, an NMOS registry at the center. We got two nodes at the bottom and a control application at the top. We have the nodes who want to register their resources at the registry. We have the control application who wants to query the registry. We have the control application who wants to talk to the nodes, for example, using ISO 5. And we have even communication between the nodes themselves, for example, a receiver who wants to retrieve an SDP file from the sender. So in this case, the registry as well as both nodes act as a server and therefore should provide some possibility for encryption. If we talk about security, there are different levels of security we have to keep in mind. So the first of all is the confidentiality, that the data passing between the client and the API is unreadable to third parties. That means that this communication has to be encrypted so that nobody is able to read it. We got the identification bit. That's the client can check whether the API it is interacting with is owned by a trusted party, which can be solved by certificates. We got the integrity. It must be clear that the data you are receiving as a client hasn't been modified. We got the authentication bit, which is closely related to the identification thing, which means that the client can check if the packets actually came from the API it's talking with. And we got the authorization bit, where the API can determine whether the client interacting with has the right to execute that requested action. So inside of the AMWA BCP-003, BCP stands for Best Current Practice, we described some of these areas and some best practices how you could implement such a security mechanism. The first big topic is establishing trust, so how to implement a public key infrastructure so that you can establish trust, that the client knows who is talking about, who is talking with. Then you got the connection security, that the communication, which has been always plain HTTP, so readable for anyone, should be upgraded to HTTPS, so to encrypted communication. Both first two topics are handled by BCP-003-01. And we got the third big topic, which is client authorization, where you decide who has the right to execute a specific action. This is handled by OAuth2 as a best current practice. And we got a new IS-10 where it's described how the REST APIs should look like to make this work. So in order to establish trust, if a client wants to talk to a server, they do a handshake. And during that handshake, the server provides a certificate to the client. And the client can now check if that certificate is valid, if the server is who he claims to be. And if that's okay, he can use the public key, which is integrated in the certificate as well, in order that they exchange a key where they agree on and then can encrypt their messages so it's not readable from outside. The first parts are handled by the public key infrastructure, and the encrypted messages are at the end, HTTPS. So this is nothing new. It's all already described in RFC 5246. It's just also used at public internet sites. If you browse to any modern internet site, you got always HTTPS. It's nothing new. We just apply it in our own network. Here you see an example of a certificate. If you browse to an HTTPS website, you see that small green lock icon at the top. You can click on details for that, and you see that it has some metadata, like a common name, so the name where it's issued to, as well as an expiration time and some other stuff, as well as a public key. What's worth to mention here is that it's always issued on a host name. Technically, you could issue a certificate onto IP address, but it's not very flexible, as an IP address could always change during the time. And if you use a host name and you have a proper DNS and DHCP implemented in your network, you are more flexible on that one. So the DNS resolution is essential. Here just a screenshot of the NMOS Explorer, where you see that nodes announce themselves with IP addresses, which is not what we want. We want that they announce themselves with their host name in order to be flexible and to use certificates which can be issued to them. If we talk about certificate management, we have to differ between a public network and a private network. If we're using the public network, as said, any modern website supports HTTPS, so you can easily use the existing infrastructure which is out there. The problem, of course, if you have a private network where you don't have internet access, or even you get some collision of your domain names and so on, because you got some local mycompany.net, for example. And in a private network, you have to provide a known certificate authority. In a public network, you could always use the existing infrastructure and the public authorities which are out there. So in our private network, we would need, as said, the certificate authority, which is reachable by any client and server. And now comes the most complicated part of this thing. I hope you stay with me. What happens here? So a certificate is nothing else. To create a certificate, you have tools like OpenSSL, which are available on any Linux distribution per default, I think. And you just create a private key. And then you use OpenSSL to create a certificate around that private key. And that certificate now contains, besides the metadata, like the common name and so on, a public key matching those private key. It's now possible to encrypt a message using the public key, which can only be deciphered using a private key. So you do this first at the root CA. So somewhere you have to start. This is the root of trust, and you have to install that one at your client. This has to be done in a private network. In a public network, there are known root CAs already around, and companies like Microsoft, Apple, or even Mozilla pre-install the root CAs of known and trusted root certificate authorities on your device, so you could skip this step. But if you got a private, you have to do this step manually. Now you got onto the intermediate certificate authority. There you basically do the same. You create a certificate with a private key, but now you ask the root CA to sign it for you using the private key. If you now have the root CA certificate with the public key, you are able to validate the signature which was made using the private key. So now you do exactly the same on the server. So you create a server certificate with a private key. You ask now the intermediate CA to sign that certificate for you. And if you have now a client who wants to talk to the server provides not only the server certificate to the client, but as well as the intermediate certificate. The client is now able to, he sees now the server certificate, and he wants to check if that's valid, if the common name is issued by, which stands in the certificate, is really the server who's talking to. And he can validate it using the signature and calculating it with the public key of the intermediate certificate. Now, how do you know the intermediate certificate is valid? Now, therefore, you have pre-installed the root certificate onto your device, and you've got now the chain of trust closed, and you know that the certificate you got from the server is a valid one and hasn't been tampered with. In order to revoke some certificates which are out there because they have normally a pretty long lifetime, you got an OCSP instance where you can check if a certificate is still valid. That was the hard part. I hope you stay with me. For example, we got here an ISO 4 where you got two nodes registering against the registry and a controller querying the registry. So therefore, the registry should provide a server certificate and have a secret key. And in the example of ISO 5, we got two nodes where the controller wants to do some changes, and therefore the nodes now act as a server, so they have to have a server certificate and a key pair as well. Another big topic of BCP-003-01 is describing some Cipher suits. So during the handshake, the client and the server negotiate a Cipher suit, optimally a very good one. Simon Rankin from the BBC did a white paper on this topic and recommended a bunch of Cipher suits. The thing is, we want interoperability. So the trade-off here is if you want to be very secure, this is always at the cost of CPU power. And if you got some embedded devices which don't have that much CPU power left besides the normal operation, you have to go down a bit with the security, allowing also embedded devices to work with and talk with encryption. So he therefore recommended a couple of should and shall support of Cipher suits. Anyway, we got a virtual workshop using a VPN where a couple vendors tried their first implementations of BCP-003-01. And we just saw that we don't all support that recommended Cipher suits. And we did it another way around. We checked which Cipher suits do we all support. And this is the result of this, but please notice that it's only 4 implementations. And this is currently under discussion further how we can agree on this. But in my opinion, it's very important to agree at least of a couple of Cipher suits which all devices have in mean, because otherwise devices are talking different languages and can't talk to each other. So as a conclusion of the first part is that broadcast devices should be able to import root CA certificates in order to validate certificates they get from others, as well as if acting as a server, they should be able to create a certificate or import one at least. A broadcast device needs to support a range of required Cipher suits, as I said, in order for interoperability. And the broadcast controller needs to trust the root CA certificates. This all requires either internet access using the existing infrastructure, or it needs to provide a local certificate authority. The infrastructure needs to provide a DNS workflow in order to issue certificates on host names. And if you leave the Cipher topic suite discussion beside, the implementation of all this is not that difficult. In NMOS, you already provide a REST API supporting HTTP, and mostly you are using some library or some tooling around which does that for you already, and they all have TLS implemented. So that's nothing new, that's pretty standard in the World Wide Web. So the infrastructure bit is a bit more challenging, as you need to provide a DNS and DHCP server, but if you look back at the EBU pyramid, it's all playing now together, and which is described in TR1001, which setup is required. However, it quite leads to not more participation from vendors. We saw that's the biggest layer of the pyramid, but nevertheless, the participation is pretty low. However, the latest Interop of the latest AMWA workshop at CBC in Montreal, Canada, was using only HTTPS registry, which was supported by every vendor. So that's going on, and that's coming more and more. And the NMOS API is really prepared for TLS. It's no problem to build up on that. So for BCP-003 the second big part is best to describe as a user with user stories. So as a user, I want my main control system to be the only system being authorized to query the network for ISO4 resources, meaning that I want to control who could see my resources on the network. The second one is, as a user, I want my main control system to be the only system being authorized to establish connections via ISO5. So I want to control who can control my devices. Until now, if we're not implementing this, if you're using a tool, it's all plain HTTP, and you can just control anything you see on the network, and you have to provide a layer of security on top of that. So to make clear, the difference between authentication and authorization is that authentication is to verify that someone is who he claims to be, which is handled by the O1 part. And the authorization is deciding if somebody really should be able to do a requested action, which is handled by O2. Here are some additional techniques needed. So O2 describes techniques how to retrieve a token to get authorized access, which will be sent by a controller together with his patch request, for example, in case of ISO5. It describes techniques for the node who now receives the token, how to validate it, and it describes of the information which is stored in the token. So how to become authorized? A good example, in my opinion, is a hotel. So if you enter a hotel and want to go to your room, you go to the reception and you provide your passport. And somebody at the reception just checks if you are who you claim to be. And this is done via credentials. And now you get issued a key card. And that key card you can use to enter your room, or for example, to enter the swimming pool area. But you won't be able to enter the maintenance area. So IS-10 now describes this in a bit more technical way. So we got an authorization server, which announces itself like other NMOS services do already, like the NMOS registry. And we got at the bottom, we got an NMOS controller who goes to the authorization server and requests an access token via the token endpoint. He provides some credentials, and he therefore gets a token back. The NMOS nodes go on, if they see an authorization server go online, they request a certificate from it, and therefore they get a public key, which they have in hand, in order to validate the certificate, the token they got from the controller. So if you now have an ISO5 patch request, you see that the NMOS controller just attaches his access token into his HTTP header and sends it with the request. The NMOS node can now use his public key, which he fetched previously, in order to validate the token. Depending on the validity and on if it's valid or not, and of the content of the token, he can now decide if he wants to execute the requested action or not. So for this, OAuth2 and JSON web tokens are used. So it's, again, nothing new. It's already wide in use in the World Wide Web. You see that the authorization server issues tokens to clients. So those who want to perform an action, like do an ISO5 request or a patch, or, for example, even an ISO4 registration request. They tend to have a short lifetime because if you lose your key card from your hotel, everybody who finds your key card could enter your room. So in this case, to add another level of security, the lifetime of the token is pretty short, but OAuth2 describes in some couple of RFCs how to refetch a new token in order to maintain your accessibility. The client provides some credentials to the authorization server. So the credentials have to be on the authorization server before. You can use some Active Directory or single sign-on mechanisms to do that, but that's out of scope of the BCP specification. Then the authorization server needs to provide a public key for resource server in order that they can validate the token. So the token looks like this. It's just some base 64 encoded JSON. It has a header and a payload, and inside the header there's an encryption algorithm written, which is used to create a signature for that header and payload. And that's appended at the end of the JWT. You see that's in blue at the left bottom. And this is done, the signature is created using the private key of the authorization server. As the node has a public key, he's now able to recalculate that signature and to check if the token has been tampered with, if it was altered. So if everything is okay, he can now check the content of the token. And up to now, we always had some very simple claims. So basically, it was just saying if you have a token, you have access. But currently under discussion is how to do this more granular. So it's thinkable of accessing or providing a token which is for a specific studio or even for a specific device. So we are currently under discussion how to do this in a good way. This, however, requires a bit more user input as we are some vendors talking about this. And at the end, the customer has to decide what's really required and what not. Some real-world considerations of BCP-003 is that the device exchange, so if a client talks to the server, now takes a bit more time, as we have an additional handshake at the start of the conversation. If you support HTTP 1.1, some TCP sessions are allowed, so that your handshake only has to be done once at the start, and after that, the rest of the communication is just plain encrypted messages. So that's okay, but you have to keep in mind it's a bit longer, but this is also very device dependent and implementation dependent. Automating certificate handling and key exchange is a vulnerability. So you don't want to run around with a USB stick and install certificates on any device of your network. So there are ways to do this automatically. However, they add a kind of vulnerability as well. But here, that's another big topic we are looking now and in the future too, how to do this in a more flexible way. But please don't let additional effort stop you from implementing security best practices, because the effort you do at the start is nothing compared to the damage which can be done if you don't secure a network and allow attackers to do their stuff. So the conclusion of this is that IS-OX APIs are based on standard information technology. We are not reinventing the wheel. We are just using mechanisms which are out there on the internet and which have proven to be good. And the internet is a wild west, so it's really proven that they are working, and we're just reusing that in our small network. And HTTP and JSON are used by many other applications. OAuth2 and JWT is already used in large scale. For example, if you want to register on a website and it shows you the button log in with my Google account or log in with my Facebook account, that's really just OAuth2 in the background running. The key exchange workflow provides a fundamental environment for HTTPS transport. That's the PKI stuff I just told. And the secure transport enables OAuth2. As the token is only base 64 encoded, basically everybody who could read your HTTP, so your plain text communication, is able to intercept your token and use it by themselves. But now adding the layer of HTTPS, you're not able to extract the token from the header. At the end is to say that the TR-101 workflow is a must-have in order to provide DNS and DHCP infrastructure for the certificate providing on a host name. And just to say that it's not only theoretical talk, it's just we had a virtual workshop in June where AMWA set up a VPN. which had a TR1001 setup, which DHCP, DNS, CA, HTTP registry, and an authorization server, which is still online, and where you can see people come online from time to time to check their implementations for interoperability with others. If you want to join this, you can talk to Thomas Edwards. I'm sure he's happy if you do that. And that's it for my part. I want to thank you. If you got any questions, please go ahead.
We have time for a few questions. If anybody has any questions? Yes, no? Okay. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Trevor Hall, DisplayLink. You talked a lot about TLS 1.2, but 1.3 deprecates quite a lot of the ciphers that that have been there in the past, and there's also added some new ciphers which are lower overhead on the CPUs. Have you considered those?
Yeah, so TLS 1.3 is now freshly available, you have to say, so it's not very common that older implementations would support this. Of course, as on the slide was stating that we have to prepare for TLS 1.3 once it's really getting in use. So yeah, we are preparing for this, and then of course update our cipher suites and so on. You have to know that, especially in this security area, it's very agile. So it's always working around, and if a cipher suite is cracked, then we have to change our recommendations and so on. So it's always a fluid process to update, and you have to always be on top of the actual standards and information you got.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, the particular point I was making that the Char cipher suite is actually a lower overhead, so you may have some advantages out of that for sort of for the smaller devices.
So
the new cipher suite that's defined in 1.3.
Yeah, because especially for the IoT stuff, you got embedded devices which really don't have much CPU power available for encrypting, and there are special cipher suites to make this possible. Yeah, so we definitely have to go to 1.3 once it's widely available and all vendors are able to support it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I had a quick question.
Yep.
Where do you think we're going to have the biggest challenges in implementing all of this stuff?
The biggest challenge actually is to provide this PKI. So how do you provide a certificate onto each device? How do you install it? There are mechanisms like, you may heard of Let's Encrypt using the ACME tooling, which can do this automatically, but as said, that's another vulnerability. That's one thing I think that's difficult how to solve this, as well as a certificate in the World Wide Web is normally has an expiration time of I think 2 years. So now we have to decide. 2 years is way too long. So we have to decide. But who does it decide? What are good values? We have to. There are long discussions I see coming how to decide on that one. Yeah.
PKI is always tough to implement. So.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You have to have a lot of discussions up front.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.